A perfect family morning. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, the sweet aroma of pancakes with syrup, and the laughter of kids. An idyllic scene shattered by a seemingly innocent comment. I signed us up for a genetic study. What could possibly go wrong? At first, it seems like nothing more than a harmless mistake in the results. But the truth hidden in the DNA uncovers cracks that threaten to destroy everything: trust, love, and a life carefully built over the years. How do you react when the results reveal more honesty than the people closest to you? This is not just a story of betrayal. It's a gripping battle for truth, with a price everyone must pay. My dear friend, be sure to subscribe to my channel if this is your first time here, and give your royal like to this video. Nigel Anderson treasured his Sunday mornings, a haven of tranquility that set the tone for his week. His routine was comforting in its simplicity: the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a leisurely scan of the news, and breakfast shared with his wife Melody and their two kids, Jasmine and Larry. The house buzzed with life, the warm scent of pancakes mingling with syrup, while the cheerful sounds of cartoons spilled from the living room. Setting his newspaper aside, Nigel picked up his coffee and spoke casually. "Melody, I signed us up for that genetic study I mentioned." Melody paused mid-bite, her fork hovering. "What study?" she asked, her tone tinged with curiosity. "The one I told you about a while back," he replied. "It's a free program offering genetic testing for families to spot potential health risks. I figured it'd be a good idea for the kids." Her expression shifted subtly, her smile losing its ease. "And you didn't think to check with me first?" Nigel chuckled, hoping to lighten the mood. "It's really nothing, just a quick saliva sample. They'll send us the results if there's anything to watch for." Melody set her fork down, crossing her arms. "I just wish you'd talk to me before making that decision." Realizing her unease, Nigel nodded. "You're right. I'll make sure to keep you in the loop next time." Her smile returned, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Okay, as long as it's just about health." The conversation ended amicably, but Melody's reaction stayed with Nigel. He chalked it up to her cautious nature and moved on. Weeks later, a plain envelope arrived containing the test results. Nigel tore it open, eager to see what the report held. Most of it detailed health-related information, but one section about ancestry made him pause. "Italian heritage, 32%, it read. Nigel frowned. Neither he nor Melody had any known ties to Italy. He laughed softly, dismissing the result. "These tests aren't always accurate," he murmured. Yet the odd detail lingered, tugging at his curiosity. That evening, once the kids were asleep, Nigel approached Melody as she browsed her phone on the couch. "Hey," he began, sitting beside her. "Did you know the kids have some Italian ancestry?" Melody froze briefly before looking up. "What are you talking about?" Nigel held out the report. "The test results. It says they're part Italian. Strange, right? Neither of us is Italian." Her smile faltered momentarily before she shrugged. "These tests aren't perfect. It's probably just an error." "Yeah, maybe," Nigel replied, though he couldn't ignore the tension in her response. Melody's usual composure seemed slightly cracked. "I've got an early meeting tomorrow," she said suddenly, standing up. "I'm heading to bed." Nigel watched her leave, an unsettling feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. Over the next few days, the thought refused to leave his mind. Melody's reaction felt off, and the ancestry detail gnawed at him. Finally, he decided to investigate further. One evening, while Melody attended her book club, Nigel logged into the genetic testing website. As he reviewed their family profile, a feature he hadn't noticed before caught his attention: a relative matching tool. Clicking on it, he saw a name listed: Lorenzo Ferretti. The name stopped him cold. "Ferretti?" he muttered. It rang a bell. Opening a new tab, he began searching. Within minutes, the pieces started coming together. Lorenzo Ferretti was Melody's boss at the advertising agency where she'd worked for years. Photos, social media posts, and public records revealed connections Nigel couldn't ignore. Lorenzo's Italian roots, frequent business trips with Melody, and their long-standing partnership painted a troubling picture. By the time Melody returned home that night, Nigel was sitting at the dining table, His laptop closed, but his thoughts racing. "You're still up?" she asked, setting her bag down. "Yeah," he said with a forced smile. "Just catching up on work." "Don't stay up too late," she replied, kissing his cheek before heading upstairs. As her footsteps faded, Nigel leaned back, the weight of suspicion pressing down on him. Over the next week, he paid closer attention to Melody. Subtle changes in her behavior stood out. She shielded her phone screen, wore a new perfume, and had an increasing number of late-night client dinners. His doubt hardened into determination. One night, as Melody slept, Nigel picked up her phone. His hands shook as he scrolled through her messages. Passing mundane exchanges, he found a thread labeled M. The texts shattered his hopes. Flirtatious banter, intimate jokes, and plans for secret rendezvous filled the screen. One message hit him like a punch to the gut. "Last night was unforgettable. Love you, M." Heart pounding, Nigel returned the phone and left the room. The betrayal weighed heavily on him. The next morning, Melody greeted him in the kitchen, seemingly oblivious. "You okay?" she asked, pouring coffee. "Yeah," he replied, avoiding her eyes. "Just a lot on my mind." She didn't press further. Meanwhile, Nigel began gathering evidence, installing tracking software on her phone and scrutinizing their finances. Over the following weeks, he uncovered irrefutable proof of Melody's affair with Lorenzo. The relationship had spanned 16 years, nearly their entire marriage. The revelation devastated him, but what cut deeper was the realization that those closest to him had likely known and said nothing. When the kids were away at a sleepover one Friday night, Nigel decided the time had come. Armed with printed messages and financial records, he sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he waited. The sound of Melody's key in the lock echoed through the house, signaling the moment their lives would irrevocably change. Melody stepped into the room with a poised elegance, juggling a takeout bag in one hand and her handbag in the other. "Hi," she said with a measured smile. "I brought Thai food. It's your favorite." Nigel didn't respond. He stood rigidly by the kitchen counter, his posture stiff as though he were anchored in place. The heavy silence made her pause mid-motion. "Is something the matter?" she ventured, setting the bag down carefully. He didn't answer immediately, but instead lifted a stack of papers, his hand trembling ever so slightly. "Melody," he began, his tone detached and icy. "How long did you think you could keep this from me?" Her brows furrowed for a moment before her expression shifted to one of cautious neutrality. "I'm not sure what you mean," she replied. The papers landed on the counter with a loud slap as Nigel's hand came down forcefully. "Don't act clueless," he snapped, his words sharp as a blade. "Lorenzo, 16 years, Melody, 16 years of lies." Her eyes flickered to the documents, and for a fleeting instant, her composure faltered. To his astonishment, she recovered swiftly. Her lips curled into a sardonic smile. "So, you finally figured it out," she said, crossing her arms with defiance. The bitterness in Nigel's stomach churned, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You're not even going to try denying it?" "Why should I?" she retorted coolly. "Did you honestly think I married you because you were my perfect match? No, Nigel. You were stable, predictable, convenient for the role of a husband while I lived my real life." Her words hit harder than a physical blow. Nigel's gaze searched hers, desperate for a hint of regret, but her eyes held only unyielding defiance. "Our marriage," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of her betrayal. "Was it ever real to you? Did it mean anything at all?" She rolled her eyes dismissively. "Of course it meant something. You're the father of my children." His voice sliced through her justification. "Am I?" The question hung in the air, suffocating in its intensity. Her confident demeanor wavered for the first time. "Nigel, let's not do this," she pleaded, but he was unrelenting. "Don't lie to me again," he growled, the fury in his voice barely restrained. "Are Jasmine and Larry my children?" Her silence confirmed his worst fears. The foundation of Nigel's world began to collapse as he absorbed the implications. "Get out," he said, his voice low and trembling with rage. Melody's defiance flared anew. "Excuse me?" she challenged. "I said get out!" he thundered, slamming his fist against the counter. The sudden noise made her flinch, but she quickly recovered her steely demeanor. "This is my home too," she said coldly. "I'm not leaving." Nigel let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "Your home? The one I worked tirelessly to provide while you betrayed me? You've earned none of it." Her gaze hardened. "You think you can just throw me out? How pathetic. That's why I needed someone like Lorenzo. He isn't weak like you." Her venomous words shattered the last of his composure. Grabbing his coat, Nigel stormed toward the door. "Stay tonight," he said without looking back, "but don't think for a moment that this is over." The cold night air greeted him as he stepped outside, its bite doing little to soothe the storm of emotions within. Staring at the dark expanse of the sky, he wrestled with the weight of her betrayal. Beneath the sorrow and anger burned, fierce and unyielding. He would not let her actions go unpunished. The next morning, Melody found him seated at the kitchen table, his demeanor unnervingly calm. It set her on edge. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing for her to sit across from him. Warily, she obeyed. "This is how it will go," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're going to tell me everything. No more lies, no more excuses. Then we'll determine the next steps." She sighed heavily and leaned back in her chair. "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry? That it was all a mistake? You wouldn't believe me anyway." "Try me," he replied flatly. After a long pause, Melody finally spoke. "It started after I got that promotion. Lorenzo and I worked closely together. One thing led to another." Nigel's voice cut through her explanation. 16 years, Melody. 16 years is not one thing leading to another. You made a choice. Every single day you chose this." "You don't understand," she snapped, frustration breaking through her cool exterior. "Our marriage was suffocating. I felt trapped." "Trapped," he repeated, his disbelief evident. "I gave you everything. A stable life, a family, and this is how you repay me." She shook her head. "You'll never understand. Lorenzo made me feel alive. He made me feel important." Nigel slammed his hand on the table, the force making her flinch. "And I didn't? I sacrificed everything for you and our children. Was that never enough?" Her silence spoke volumes. Rising to his feet, his voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "You will regret this, not just for what you've done to me, but for what you've done to our children. They will know the truth. They'll see who you really are." Her confidence faltered. "Leave them out of this, Nigel. They're innocent in all of this." "So was I," he replied, his voice resolute. Towering over her, he added, "Pack your things. You're leaving tonight." She opened her mouth to argue, but froze under the unwavering determination in his eyes. For the first time, she realized how serious he was. Nigel didn't wait for her response. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of their crumbling world. Refusing to succumb to despair, he threw himself into action. His mind raced with plans, each more calculated than the last. If she thought she could walk away unscathed, she was gravely mistaken. Late into the night, as Melody stayed in the guest room, oblivious to his scheming, Nigel pored over emails, texts, and financial records. Each hidden transaction, every clandestine gift labeled as a work expense, was methodically documented. The evidence mounted: lavish dinners, secret getaways, and trysts, all disguised as professional commitments. One evening, he sat at the dining table, surrounded by the damning proof of her betrayal. Upstairs, Melody's faint footsteps served as a haunting reminder of the life they'd once shared. On his phone, he stared at a photo of Lorenzo's seemingly perfect family, his wife, Isabella, and their 2 children, blissfully unaware of the storm about to engulf them. It was time to act. The next morning, Nigel picked up the phone and dialed Isabella's number. The conversation was brief, but brimming with tension. "Isabella," a voice announced over the phone, calm but resolute. "This is Nigel Anderson, Melody's husband." There was a pause, long enough to feel uncomfortable, before Isabella replied cautiously, "Yes? What is this regarding?" "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm. "It's about Lorenzo. There's something crucial you need to know." The silence that followed was weighted, oppressive. After a moment's hesitation, Isabella's voice emerged, tentative but steady. "I'll come to your office tomorrow." The next day, Isabella entered Nigel's office, her apprehension evident. He greeted her with a solemn nod and motioned to a chair. Without a word, he slid a folder across the desk. As she opened it, her hands shook. Inside was an undeniable trove of evidence: intimate emails, hotel invoices, and photos capturing Lorenzo and Melody slipping away together at various events. Her voice was barely audible as she asked, "How long has this been going on?" 16 years, Nigel responded, his voice steady but laden with gravity. "I hate that you're learning this way, but you deserve the truth." For a fleeting moment, Isabella's composure cracked, her face betraying her devastation. Then she straightened, her voice firmer now. "What do you intend to do?" Nigel didn't hesitate. "Expose them, but I can't do it alone." Though her grip on the desk tightened, Isabella nodded. "I'll help." The weeks that followed saw them working in secret, crafting their strategy with meticulous care. Isabella provided details about Lorenzo's routines and financial habits, while Nigel assembled a timeline so damning that it left no room for doubt. They chose a company event, one where both Lorenzo and Melody would be present, as the setting for their revelation. When the night arrived, Nigel, impeccably dressed, entered the grand ballroom with Isabella at his side. The room buzzed with conversation and the soft clinking of glasses. Across the space, Lorenzo and Melody stood too close, their body language betraying a familiarity far beyond professional bounds. Nigel's jaw tightened at the sight. Isabella leaned in and whispered, "Are you ready for this?" His response was resolute, more than ever. As the guests settled for dinner, Nigel stepped onto the stage. The event's organizer, unaware of his true purpose, handed him the microphone. He took it, his demeanor composed, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice clear and commanding. "Thank you for being here tonight. It's an honor to address you. But tonight, my message isn't about work. It's about something far more significant: honesty and trust." The room fell silent, every gaze fixed on him. Across the crowd, Melody's face turned pale, and Lorenzo shifted uneasily in his seat. Nigel continued, "For years I've believed in the importance of integrity, in our professional lives, in friendships, and most importantly, in our families. But when that trust is broken, the pain is immeasurable." Behind him, a screen lit up with images, incriminating photos of Lorenzo and Melody, snippets of emails, and records of their clandestine encounters. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Melody leapt to her feet, her face a mixture of fury and shock. "What are you doing, Nigel?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Revealing the truth," he replied calmly. "You've been living a lie, Melody, and it's time everyone saw it for what it is." Lorenzo stood, his voice unsteady as he pleaded, "Let's not make a scene." Isabella rose as well, her tone sharp and unyielding. "It's far too late for that," she said icily. "You made your choices. Now it's time to face the fallout." The room buzzed with whispers and disbelief. Some guests began recording the unfolding drama on their phones. Melody, seething, stormed toward Nigel. "You're pathetic," she hissed. "Dragging personal matters into public like this?" Nigel's expression didn't waver. "Pathetic?" he echoed. "Pathetic is lying to your family and betraying those who trusted you. This," he gestured to the room, "is accountability." Under the crushing weight of the evidence, Melody's defiance faltered. Lorenzo's attempts to salvage the moment only deepened their humiliation. Without another word, Nigel stepped off the stage, Isabella following close behind. Outside, in the crisp night air, Isabella looked at him and said softly, "You did it." "No," he corrected. "We did it." The fallout was swift and merciless. Nigel anonymously forwarded the evidence to Lorenzo's company board, exposing not only his infidelity, but also his misuse of corporate funds to sustain the affair. Within days, Lorenzo was dismissed, his career in shambles. Nigel wasn't finished. At the Anderson family's annual reunion, he took his final stand. As relatives gathered in the backyard for laughter and connection, Nigel rose with a remote in hand. "Can I have everyone's attention?" he called, his voice steady but firm. The chatter ceased, and all eyes turned toward him. "Family," he began, "is built on trust, and when that trust is betrayed, it's our responsibility to confront it." Melody's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of alarm. "Nigel, please don't," she whispered urgently. Ignoring her, he clicked the remote, and a slideshow began on a large screen. Photos and messages exposing Melody's betrayal filled the display. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gathering. "For 16 years, Nigel said, his voice steady, "Melody has been having an affair with her boss, Lorenzo Ferretti. Many of you knew, none of you told me." The weight of his words settled over the crowd like a suffocating blanket. Melody sprang to her feet, her face twisted with rage. "How dare you humiliate me like this?" she shouted. Nigel's voice remained unshaken. "You humiliated yourself. I'm just making sure everyone sees it." The gathering dissolved into stunned silence as Melody stormed away, her disgrace complete. Nigel turned back to the family. "This is what betrayal looks like," he said simply. Then he walked away, leaving Melody and Lorenzo to face the wreckage they had created. The night air felt cooler, lighter. For Nigel, it was the start of a new journey, one defined by reclaiming his dignity and ensuring the guilty would never escape the weight of their actions. Nigel's voice sliced through the heavy silence of the room, resolute and unforgiving. "You had no right," he declared, his words brimming with a bitterness that demanded attention. "No right to betray me, to lie to our children, to deceive everyone sitting here." Across the room, Melody stood motionless, the weight of his gaze dismantling her composure piece by piece. His accusations landed with a crushing inevitability, leaving no space for rebuttal. "You made your choices, Melody," Nigel continued, his tone unwavering. "And now you'll face the consequences." Jasmine and Larry, their teenage children, sat frozen, their faces reflecting the raw shock and heartbreak of the moment. It was Jasmine who found her voice first, though it trembled as she spoke. "Mom," she managed, her cheeks streaked with tears. "Is it true?" She reached out tentatively, but Jasmine instinctively drew back, her movement sharp and decisive. "Don't," she said firmly, shaking her head. "Just don't." Larry stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. "You lied," he said, his voice thick with anger. "To us. To everyone." The rejection from her children was a crushing blow, and Melody sank into her chair, her resolve crumbling before their eyes. Nigel turned his attention to the rest of the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of friends and family who sat in uncomfortable silence, their complicity now glaring. "And for those of you who knew and stayed silent," he said coldly, "your silence was betrayal. Trust is a two-way street, and if you can't be honest, you don't belong in my life." Heads lowered in shame. Cousins averted their eyes, aunts shifted uneasily, and even Nigel's brother stared at the floor. The once vibrant social network Melody had cultivated began to fracture. Friends who had once admired her charisma now distanced themselves, unwilling to be tarnished by her scandal. The final nail came from Isabella, Lorenzo's wife. Filing for divorce, she ensured the details of Melody's infidelity spread quickly among their shared circle. Lorenzo's attempts to salvage his reputation proved futile. His career disintegrated, and his marriage lay in ruins. Desperation overtook Melody. One evening she arrived at Nigel's doorstep, her face pale and streaked with tears. Kneeling on the porch, her voice wavered as she pleaded, "Nigel, please, I made a horrible mistake. I was selfish and reckless, but I love you. I love our family. Please, don't shut me out." Nigel stepped outside, his expression impassive, his tone measured but devoid of sympathy. "Love?" he asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Is that what you call 16 years of deceit?" Melody's tears fell freely as she begged, "I'll do anything. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just let me try to fix this." Nigel shook his head, his determination unyielding. "You had 16 years to make it right. You chose him. Now you'll live with that choice." Without another word, he turned and stepped back inside, closing the door as Melody's sobs echoed into the night. In the aftermath, Nigel poured his energy into rebuilding his life. He devoted himself to his children, working tirelessly to earn back their trust and create a stable, loving home. Jasmine and Larry chose to stay with him, finding solace in their father's steadfast presence. Together, they forged new routines and traditions, strengthening their bond and fostering a sense of security. Nigel also began rediscovering parts of himself that had been neglected during his marriage. He joined a hiking club, rekindled his love for photography, and even ventured into the world of dating. Each small step forward brought him closer to reclaiming his identity. Meanwhile, Melody and Lorenzo's lives unraveled. Melody moved into a modest apartment, her once bustling social life reduced to fleeting connections with a few superficial acquaintances. Lorenzo, struggling with unemployment and an expensive divorce, floundered. The strain of their actions ultimately shattered their relationship. One evening, as Nigel and his children gathered around the dinner table, the room was filled with laughter and warmth. They shared a joke, their closeness evident in every smile. In that moment, Nigel felt a deep sense of contentment. Though the journey had been painful, he had emerged stronger, surrounded by the people who mattered most. For the first time in years, he felt truly free. Melody continued to seek his forgiveness, but Nigel remained resolute. The scars she had left were too deep to mend. Her choices became a haunting reminder of the cost of dishonesty and betrayal. Nigel, however, embraced the life he had rebuilt. The love of his children and the promise of a brighter future gave him strength. During a therapy session, he reflected, "It's not easy letting go of the past, but I'm working on rebuilding, one step at a time." Later that day, as he sat on a park bench watching autumn leaves drift to the ground, his phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number appeared. "Hi, Nigel. This is Stevie. We met at a networking event a few months back. I'd love to reconnect if you're interested." Nigel smiled, a flicker of curiosity stirring within him. He hadn't thought much about Stevie, but the idea of reaching out felt promising. As he typed his reply, he realized just how far he had come. "Hey, Stevie. Of course I remember. Let's catch up this weekend." After sending the message, Nigel leaned back on the bench, a quiet anticipation filling his chest. The past had shaped him, but the future was his to claim. There was something about Stevie's genuine warmth that stayed with Nigel. Her kindness had left a deep impression, revealing a sincerity he hadn't realized he craved until much later. When the weekend arrived, Nigel found himself standing in front of a charming little cafe, nervously adjusting his jacket. He had taken extra care to look his best, hoping to convey the right impression. Yet as he stood there, he questioned what he was even expecting to find. Would Stevie still be the person he remembered so vividly? What would they talk about? His train of thought was interrupted when she appeared around the corner, her smile radiating as their eyes met. She wore a simple coat with a scarf, her hair pulled back in an easy ponytail that suited her effortlessly. Nigel couldn't help but notice her quiet confidence. "Nigel, it's wonderful to see you," she said warmly, her eyes alight with sincerity. Rising to greet her, he mirrored her smile. "It's great to see you too, Stevie. It's been far too long." They shared a brief hug before she gestured toward the entrance of the cafe. "Shall we head in?" she asked. Once they settled at a cozy table, Nigel was struck by how naturally the conversation flowed between them. They spoke openly about their lives, their work, favorite novels, and the hurdles they had each faced in recent months. Their time together felt effortless, free of any awkwardness or tension. It was simply two people reconnecting. After a while, Nigel took a deep breath, meeting Stevie's eyes. "I've been doing a lot of soul searching," he admitted. "Things have been challenging lately, and I'm still trying to figure out where I'm going." Stevie listened intently, her expression soft and understanding. "I know how that feels," she said gently. "Life has a way of knocking us off balance." Nigel nodded, his voice tinged with emotion. "I feel like I've lost so much, and I'm not sure how to move forward." Reaching across the table, Stevie placed her hand on his. "You don't need to have all the answers right now," she reassured him. "Take your time and remember, you don't have to face this alone. The path forward might not be clear yet, but it's there. Nigel glanced at her hand resting over his, a glimmer of hope stirring within him. Her words resonated deeply. It wasn't about having every step mapped out, but about embracing the journey and recognizing he didn't have to walk it alone anymore. Across town, Melody sat at her kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice in front of her. Months had passed since the divorce, yet stability still felt unattainable. Lorenzo's financial collapse had taken everything they'd built together along with it. No longer living in the grand house they once shared, Melody's future felt like a murky fog. Rubbing her temples, she tried to process how her life had unraveled so completely. Once, she had believed their love was indestructible. Now she wasn't even sure who she was without it. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Lorenzo. "Melody, we need to talk. I've been thinking about everything." She let out a bitter laugh. Talk? About what? She thought, her emotions churning. She typed out a terse reply. "There's nothing left to say, Lorenzo." After a brief pause, she hit send and set the phone aside. The passion that had once defined their relationship had been replaced by resentment and sorrow. Melody had fought to save what they had, but it was clear they were no longer the people they once were. As weeks turned into months, Nigel and Stevie's bond deepened. Their weekends were spent wandering the city, strolling through parks, and diving into conversations that ranged from light-hearted memories to profound reflections. With Stevie, Nigel felt a renewed sense of grounding and clarity. One evening, over dinner at a cozy restaurant, Stevie looked at him thoughtfully. "I can't pretend to fully understand everything you've been through," she said softly, "but I'm so glad you're here now. I'm grateful we found each other." Nigel met her gaze, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I feel the same way, Stevie. You've brought something back into my life I didn't think I'd find again. I didn't believe I could trust anyone, but with you, I feel safe. I don't feel alone anymore." Her smile widened as she reached for his hand. "You don't have to be alone," she said gently. "Not unless you choose to be." Meanwhile, Melody sat in a small cafe, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. She had arranged to meet Rachel, a friend from her former life, hoping for some clarity. Rachel arrived with a sympathetic smile and took the seat across from her. "I know it's been a tough time, Melody," Rachel began, "but you have to stop clinging to the past. You can't move forward if you keep carrying it with you." Melody sighed, frustration evident in her voice. "I don't even know where to begin," she admitted. "Everything I tried to hold on to has fallen apart." Rachel leaned closer, her gaze filled with understanding. "You might feel like you've lost everything, but you haven't. You're still here, and that means you can rebuild. It won't happen overnight, but starting over is possible." Melody stared at her coffee, her heart heavy. Maybe Rachel was right. To move forward, she needed to forgive herself first. Walking hand in hand with Stevie through the park one evening, Nigel felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Letting go of the past had been a gradual process, but it allowed him to believe in the possibility of a new chapter. For the first time in a long while, he felt ready to embrace it. Later, standing on a quiet beach with Stevie, the sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air. The sky blazed with shades of orange and pink as the sun set, while the laughter of their children echoed in the background. Nigel turned to Stevie, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm happy," he said simply. "For the first time in years, I truly feel happy." Stevie's eyes softened as she smiled at him. "You've worked so hard to get here," she replied, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Together they gazed out at the horizon, the weight of their pasts finally lifting as they stood fully present in the moment. Nigel's eyes took on a faraway look, as if he were tracing the paths of memories ebbing like tides upon a distant shore. His life had been shaped by years of hardship and healing, each moment a thread in a rich, if painful, tapestry. Thoughts of Melody surfaced, the choices that had once divided them, carving deep chasms in their lives. But standing there with Stevie, their children's laughter ringing through the salty air as waves kissed the sand, those moments seemed to belong to another era, like relics of a long-past story. I've come to understand a lot, Nigel said quietly, his gaze resting lovingly on the children. Forgiveness, letting go of what I couldn't change, learning how to trust again. Stevie placed a steadying hand on his arm, anchoring him in the present. They watched their children play, joy radiating from their tiny frames like sunlight spilling across the shore. And about love, Nigel added softly, his voice carrying a weight of emotion. The kind that endures, not the fleeting kind, the kind that stays. He smiled, a glimmer of peace breaking through years of strain. Far away, in a quiet house on the edge of the town they once knew, Melody sat by a window in a worn armchair. The world outside felt distant and unfamiliar, a fading photograph of the life she once lived. Her home was filled with echoes of the past, faded pictures, fragments of moments she could barely remember. The streets she used to walk felt like uncharted territory now, foreign in their emptiness. She held a mug of coffee, its sharp bitterness mirroring the turmoil within her. For years, Melody had run from her mistakes, avoiding the truths she feared most. Time and distance had only emphasized the enormity of what she had lost, and the silence that filled her house made it impossible to ignore. The buzz of her phone cut through her thoughts. Without much interest, she reached for it, assuming it was another bill or some unwelcome reminder of her fractured existence. But when she saw the name on the screen, her breath caught. Lorenzo. Her finger hesitated over the screen, torn between burying the past and confronting it. "Hello," she said, her voice little more than a fragile whisper. "Melody." Lorenzo's voice was strained yet familiar, slicing through her defenses. "I know this might not be a good time, but we need to sort things out. The house, the finances, all of it." His words landed heavily, each one a reminder of the broken pieces they had yet to pick up. Melody leaned back, closing her eyes. "What do you want me to say, Lorenzo? We've already been through this. There's nothing left." A silence stretched before Lorenzo's tone sharpened. "We're still tied, Melody. Legally, financially. You can't just disappear." "I already did," she replied softly, her voice trembling but firm. "A long time ago." She ended the call without waiting for his response, staring at the blank screen as silence crept back into the room. Despite her efforts to convince herself she was fine, moments like this laid bare the hollowness of her attempts at moving forward. On the beach, the setting sun cast the world in hues of gold and amber. Nigel turned to Stevie, gratitude welling within him. They had managed to piece together a life from the remnants of brokenness, not perfect, but solid and real. "Do you remember when we met?" Stevie asked, her voice carrying a wistful tone. Nigel laughed, the memory bringing warmth to his face. "I wasn't sure I could trust anyone again, but you made it feel possible." Stevie's smile was soft, her hand tightening around his. "You were careful, but I could tell you had so much love left in you. You just had to find it again." Nigel turned fully to her, his expression serious yet tender. "You were patient with me. I wasn't the easiest person to be around back then." Her eyes met his with unspoken understanding. "We both carried our burdens, Nigel, but we found each other when it counted." His voice thickened with emotion. "I'm just so thankful I did." They stood there in a shared silence, the rhythmic sound of waves and the laughter of their children weaving a soothing harmony around them. The sharp edges of the past had softened, leaving behind echoes that no longer hurt. Nigel had fought hard to reach this point, and with Stevie by his side, the life they had built felt whole. As night settled over her small-town home, Melody sat alone on her porch. The encroaching shadows seemed to mirror the isolation she felt. She had spent the day sorting through boxes of old photos and keepsakes, snapshots of her children, mementos of family gatherings that once sparked joy. Now, they felt like artifacts from another world. The chill of evening seeped into her skin as she rubbed her hands together, trying to dispel the cold inside her. She had told herself time would heal her wounds, but the more she pushed forward, the larger her losses loomed in her heart. Her phone buzzed again. This time she glanced at it immediately. A message from her son, the one who had distanced himself after their lives fell apart. Mom, I hope you're okay. I've been thinking about you. The words hit her deeply, unraveling a knot of guilt and longing in her chest. Trembling, she typed a response. I'm sorry. I've been trying to make sense of everything. I miss you. She hesitated before pressing send, knowing there was no undoing the damage she had caused. But perhaps, if she was willing to try, there was a chance to rebuild. The path ahead would be difficult, but she had to take the first step. On the beach, as dusk embraced the horizon, Nigel packed up their belongings. He turned to Stevie, his smile quiet but resolute. It's amazing to see how far we've come. Stevie looked out at their children playing, her expression full of gentle pride. It hasn't been easy, but I'm so glad we've done it together. Nigel squeezed her hand, the warmth of her presence steadying him. They had faced heartbreak and made mistakes, but they had also fought for a life worth living, a life imperfect but undeniably their own. Surrounded by love, laughter, and the sound of the waves, it was enough. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.